Kia ora, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Big welcome to the audience in this space and to the online audience as well. This is a Fabian session on new ways of mobilising in the digital era. Dr. Nina Hall is here on sabbatical leave. She's Assistant Professor in International Relations at Johns Hopkins University at their School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna. This year she's a Senior Fellow at the German Internet Institute and a Visiting Fellow at the Centre for Strategic Studies at Victoria. She's been researching digital advocacy organisations for the last 5 years, and Oxford University Press are going to publish her book early next year. But she's going to give us some of the learnings from that book tonight. Cassie Hartendorp, the Director of ActionStation, will respond to Nina's presentation, and Nina's going to introduce her in due course. So, great pleasure now to hand over to Nina Hall.
Tēnā tātou, tēnei taku mihi, kia koutou katoa e hui hui mai nei. It's wonderful to be here with you all tonight in Wellington, for those of you joining in person and those of you joining online, thanks for joining. I'm delighted to be sharing this work with you. It's been over 5 years in the making, and it's a real pleasure to do it with Cassie, who I want to introduce now before going through to my talk. So Cassie is the current director for ActionStation, an organisation I'll be speaking about. And she's organised across different movements, including Te Tiriti justice, feminism, anti-racism, economic justice, and the union movement. She's a former youth worker with LGBTIQ young people and is an active member of Takatapui communities. She spent 3 years co-editing Aunties magazine, a one-off magazine about political organising in Aotearoa. And her most recent studies were at Te Wānanga o Raukawa in Ahunga Tikanga, Māori Laws and Philosophy, where she was blessed to have learned from many Māori thinkers such as Moana Jackson, Mike Paki, Ani Mikare, and Merema Pittman. She joined ActionStation as a community organiser, where she brought her relational movement experience to a digitally based organisation. She's led campaigns on issues like Protect Ihu Mātau and the Black Lives Movement in Aotearoa. And in late 2020, she took on the role as the director of ActionStation. And she's speaking in that capacity today, after Laura Kono-Rapira, who I'll also speak about today, left to go to Australia, where she took up a new role. So Cassie is going to complement tonight's talk, which is based on my 5 years of research, with her own insights into what makes ActionStation unique as an organisation, what drew her there, what it's like to work every day in a digital advocacy organisation, as well as some of the challenges. So I want to frame my contribution. I should note this is the first time I'm presenting to a New Zealand audience, so it's a real privilege to do that. And I'm going to start off by framing it within a New Zealand context. And for those of you who are wondering why we have Matariki up here, it's because, as you know, next year New Zealand will celebrate for the first time Matariki as a public holiday, and that's thanks in part to the work of ActionStation. ActionStation campaigned very hard through online petition last year, calling for Labour to create a new public holiday. They ran a strong campaign mobilising a range of New Zealanders, encouraging them to sign this petition and spread the word. And in the end, they and another organisation collectively got over 30,000 signatures in support of Matariki as a public holiday, which they delivered in July last year to Labour. And Labour went on to announce it as a policy and said if they won the election that they would deliver on this, which they then did. Now, of course, Matariki as a public holiday is one of only many things that ActionStation has done, and this campaign came on the back of many Māori activists who had also encouraged the government to recognise Matariki as a public holiday. But what I want to talk about today is really the model of advocacy, what makes ActionStation distinct from both other organisations within New Zealand and to situate its work transnationally. Because I'm an international relations scholar, I'm really interested in the synergies and the connections that span the globe. And ActionStation is one of actually 20 organizations that follow exactly the same model, which I'll describe to you today. And these organizations exist, these digital advocacy organizations, from Hungary to Poland to Sweden to South Africa to Israel, so in very diverse countries. And I want to talk about what's distinct about the model and the strengths and limits of it. And this is drawing on a book that comes out sometime early next year, depending on how quickly the production process happens. Oxford has it in their hands, which is asking very questions about transnational advocacy. So I'm speaking to a broad body of international relations literature that asks questions about how activism occurs across borders. But I'm asking a specific question, which is how has that been changing in the digital era? And there are a few sort of starting points that the literature would suggest. Firstly, in the 90s, we had a lot of techno-optimism, which may seem a little odd today as we've probably gone down a techno-pessimism, but there was a real hope that electronic digital means would make it possible to create these new transnational communities, to push for progressive change. People talked about how it would be possible to ignore borders and create the kinds of communities based on common values and objectives that were once almost the exclusive prerogative of nationalism. And I should say these scholars were definitely thinking about the left taking advantage of the internet. In this early era, it was seen that grassroots activism would thrive on the kind of infrastructure that the internet was built on. And some of this sentiment has gone on and holds today. There are people like Manuel Castells, a sociologist, who's also argued that movements spread by contagion in a world networked by wireless internet and marked by fast, viral diffusion of images and ideas. And this kind of argument's probably familiar to many of you. You know, you think about social media, tweets, Facebook, everything can spread quickly and easily across borders, right? Well, I wanted to take up these assumptions and test them out in my work. This is the theoretical contribution of the book. And in the discipline I'm situated in, international relations, no one had really tested this out. There was a lot of assumptions that we were going to see new kinds of transnational communities emerging, but no one had really teased out whether this was indeed the case. And the argument of the book is twofold, and I'll speak predominantly to the first one today, but I'm happy to talk about the second one in Q&A. The first argument is that we've seen new forms of advocacy organization emerge. One example of this is ActionStation, which is why Cassie is also here with me today. And these are organizations that are born in the internet era and so can take advantage of the affordances of it to be multi-issue, rapid response, and member-driven. And I'll talk through that. And they're distinct from NGOs like Oxfam or Greenpeace. The second feature, which is really interesting, is that while we see transnational learning and collaboration happening, and even though we operate in a globalized world, we don't see most of these organizations targeting international institutions. So we see these groups mostly targeting the nation state. The argument here is kind of counter to those quotes we saw at the beginning, that we're going to see these transnational communities emerge, borders are going to disappear, everyone is going to be a sort of transnational collective community fighting for progressive or other values. And I would nuance that argument. So I want to speak through mostly the first today, but obviously feel free to ask questions about the second. So those of you in the room, how many of you actually heard of ActionStation before when you walked in, just out of curiosity? Okay, so those of you online, that was like, I'd say 95, 98% of the room, which is great. It means that I don't need to do maybe as much background as I otherwise would. But you may not be aware that ActionStation is a member of a network that includes groups like Move On in the US, that was founded in 1998 as a progressive advocacy organization. Move On was very strong in the anti-Iraq war movement. They were one of the leaders of it. And there's actually been a book written by a colleague of mine, David Karpf, called the Move On Effect, where he argues that Move On, the kind of activism of using online petitions to mobilize people rapidly around a range of progressive causes, really shaped American political advocacy. Now, this book has had a really, I would say, big effect as well, it's effect of its own, on US academic debates, because he shows how other advocacy groups, other interest groups in the US have sought to emulate these practices. We've seen other groups emerge. GetUp in Australia, which is a powerful digital advocacy organisation. And there's work written on it by Ariadne Vroman and their impact. 38 Degrees in the UK. And then there are other organisations like Some of Us, Ours, 350.org that focuses more on climate. And all of these groups share a common DNA. They use digital analytics to campaign. They survey members frequently to understand what issues they're most concerned by, and they all share progressive values. Now, what my book seeks to do is, in a way, replicate what David Karpf did with the Move On Effect and talk about that at a global level. How is this model, what effect has it had globally? We know that collectively these groups have over 20 million members. Now, membership is obviously different, and for some it's subscribing to an email. It's not turning up to a meeting in the way that you would, say, for Rotary or Amnesty International in the old days. You don't have to donate necessarily to be a member, so membership is much more fluid. These organizations exist across 6 continents, 19 countries, and they claim 1 in 15 domestic voters. And I should note that membership is more fluid on purpose. The idea is to bring people in who otherwise wouldn't be involved in campaigning. And so it can be a critique of these organizations often, oh, it's just so easy to be a member, how can they have any impact? They don't have really committed members. But we can unpack that a bit in today's talk. And many of the organizations, in fact, all of them that I talk about today are part of a network. The network's called Open. And this is one of the summits. They host regular summits in normal times, pre-COVID, in person. I'm actually up the back in blue, up here. And there's a number of ActionStation staff. Elliot is on the left holding the banner, as well as people from across the world, from Germany, from the US, who are taking part in this summit where these groups come together to share ideas and information. Now, what I've found through my research, where I've conducted over 200 interviews around the world, from Vancouver to Germany to Stockholm to Sydney, and I've gone and interviewed these activists who, I should say, work for these organizations as permanent paid staff, right? These aren't just social movements of people who are tweeting. These are people who work in a permanent role in an organization. Is first of all that in many cases they have bite in election time. So unlike some other NGOs which try and be neutral, many of these organizations, these digital advocacy organizations, actually run active campaigns trying to oust conservative candidates or push for progressive candidates. GetUp in Australia is particularly well known for this. You can see volunteers down the bottom who have campaigned very strongly for progressive candidates and against conservatives. This is one of their banners. Tony, abstinence is not a climate option. And they were very strong trying to get rid of Tony Abbott and oust him from his seat, which they were, with others, successful in doing. And he actually named GetUp as one of the reasons he thinks that he lost his seat. There are also digital advocacy organizations are campaigning not just in elections, but also on issue-based campaigns on a range of progressive issues. Here's a little bit more to give you a historical perspective. During the anti-free trade protests, ActionStation was one of a number of organizations mobilizing people. This is just here in Civic Square, where 1,000 people protested against the TPPA. And across in Germany, I was actually there as an observer in Berlin. 250,000 people protested outside the Brandenburg Gate, which you can see down the bottom, against what was the US-EU trade agreement, the TTIP, and the Canadian-EU trade agreement. And Campact, in fact, was seen as one of the most powerful influences of public debate in the German context, and also had an impact on anti-trade campaigns across Europe. Now, I want to come through, though, to these three distinctive qualities that I identify in my research. And these are qualities that I say define what a digital advocacy organization is, as compared with other advocacy organizations like Oxfam or Greenpeace or Human Rights Watch. And I should note, I'm not saying that this makes them better or worse. I'm trying to analytically understand what it is that they add within the activist ecology, if you like. So the first is that their rapid response. That groups like ActionStation or Campact or Move On, they can respond very quickly to new issues, to breaking news. They can do that because of the internet. It's very quick to launch a campaign like the one I showed at the beginning of Matariki, because you have the infrastructure already and you can just set up a new petition page. Other organizations like, say, Transparency International tend to have much more long-term commitment to a cause because of the way they're set up. Right? Transparency runs an annual report on which country has the highest or lowest corruption, and they've invested a lot of time to build up that knowledge and a lot of time to write the report. They're not going to just drop it from one day to the next. Secondly, these organizations cover multiple issues. So they can cover anything from LGBT issues to the environment, to union issues, to education, to saving a library, to climate change. And that's their strength, is that they can quickly pivot from one issue to the next because of the internet and the fact that they can launch campaigns so quickly. Now, when we think of other organizations like Human Rights Watch, they tend to have much more sustained campaigns on issues where they have some expertise, right? They know about human rights abuses occurring, say, in Syria or in Myanmar, and they write a report on that, and that is what they are bringing to the debate. Thirdly, as you can see from ActionStation, they drive people-powered change. They're member-driven. And I would argue that even organizations that might have members, like Greenpeace, aren't quite as member-driven as the organizations that I study. And that's because the way that digital activist organizations operate is that they can very closely listen to their members' preferences. They can aggregate quickly surveys. They can say, what are the top 10 issues for you this week? What do you care about? And respond and drive their campaigning. They can also see, using digital analytics, what campaigns are most clicked on online, or which emails get the most action rates. Do people actually open the email and then click on the petition or click on the donate and deliver? And they can also see which framing of different issues. So if you have a campaign against a trade agreement, do people respond more if it's framed around the environment or framed around human rights? Or maybe there's half of the audience that would respond more when it's around human rights and another half on environment. And you can actually segment your email list to identify what messages will work best with which audiences. And this kind of campaigning is something that I would argue the older groups are starting to do, starting to emulate, but that the digital advocacy organizations have really pioneered. And the result of this, I argue in the book, leads to what I call digitally networked power, that they're able to bring people together and to try and mobilize collectives of people to take action on the streets, like you saw with that anti-TPPA protest, as well as online. And older organizations tend to just broadcast, to say, hey, we've got this new report. Look at the report, right? It's about sharing information rather than mobilizing. So I've briefly described the model. I want to just talk a little bit with a couple of examples about the strengths and limits of it. So one of the strengths is that, as I said, they can respond quickly. And this is 38 degrees in the UK in September. September 2015, as you may recall, there was an increase in refugees and asylum seekers crossing the Mediterranean into Europe. And many people were very concerned that many were drowning and not being able to enter into Europe. 38 degrees quickly, within a matter of hours, set up this campaign. The campaign was aimed at local councils rather than the central government. And they asked, in this case, Norwich, to open up and to host refugees. So Norwich City Council should agree to take in 50 new refugees. And they did this throughout the country. They had 137,000 people sign. And in fact, they were part of, obviously, a broader movement. They weren't the only one. And the Prime Minister David Cameron at the time actually did announce that the UK would accept 20,000 more Syrian refugees over a 4 to 5 year period. So we saw a very rapid response campaign mobilising a broad range of people across the UK. Now, what is interesting for me, though, then, is that 38 Degrees, after that success and that declaration, essentially stopped campaigning on refugee issues. Why? Because member interest moved on to something else. In fact, member interest moved on to things like saving the bees. Now, when I went to visit them about a year later, there was a big campaign amongst the refugee advocacy community of saving children who were stuck in the camp in Calais on the French side of the English Channel. But 38 Degrees wasn't really finding much interest amongst its members for this campaign, even though it was arguably a very important campaign to be running. They were finding amongst their members there was more interest in issues around conservation of the bees, so they didn't run a campaign. And this is showing you that while they were able to be very rapid and reactive, it was much harder for them to run a sustained campaign, and a sustained campaign particularly on minority issues. And I've also seen this example happen where, because they're so reactive and responsive to their members' preferences, unless they get a majority, they can't really run a campaign. I'm talking here about 38 Degrees specifically, who I would see as one of the most member-driven in this network. And they polled their members on Brexit in the lead up to the referendum, and they found they didn't have a strong enough majority to run a campaign to keep the UK in the EU. Although all of their staff wanted to see that, their membership was somewhat divided. And I should stress here that 38 Degrees sees itself as a progressive organisation, and we know that, you know, a progressive position on Brexit is a complicated one, some might argue. So they ended up campaigning neutrally in that particular context, even though their staff were very committed to the idea of the UK staying in the EU. Now, that example has been heavily debated amongst both 38 Degrees staffers and others within the open network. And I think, though, it's symptomatic of a broader issue, that one of the tensions in this model of being so reactive and responsive and member-driven is this point that it's hard to campaign on a sustained basis for issues around minority rights, and that groups end up reacting to members' preferences. And out of these sorts of conversations, ActionStation itself has gone on a journey and decided it wanted to focus much more on transforming members' preferences and to try and run sustained campaigns, even if they don't initially get popular support. And so operating a much more value-driven logic. Now, they started this a couple of years ago with Marianne Elliott when she was executive director, as well as with Laura O'Connor-Rapira, who was the next executive director. And in the lead up to the 2017 election, they ran a series of kai and korero, which were about bringing ActionStation members together to reflect on what were the values that they wanted the organisation to be run by, and specifically what was their vision for Aotearoa New Zealand in 2040. And they chose that date because it was 200 years after the Treaty of Waitangi was signed. About 5,000 members took part in these conversations that were self-organised but with the support of ActionStation. And they, from this, identified a crowdsourced people's agenda, which identified key values like kaitiakitanga, aroha, manakitanga, equality and fairness, community and belonging. And then staff at ActionStation took these values as a mandate for driving forward their future campaigning. And from this, they also developed their own strategic thinking around how they wanted their campaigns to be directed. And ActionStation, based on this community outreach, decided that they really wanted to work towards a bold, progressive vision of New Zealand, where Māori had rangatiratanga, and that if there was any conflict within a campaign between competing values, then Te Tiriti would have precedence in giving guidance in our decisions. So you can see that's very different from the model I was painting with 38 degrees. And a result of that, we saw a number of campaigns in the last couple of years, which ActionStation has really driven strongly, from campaigns on justice reform here on the left. This was a collaboration also with Just Speak, where they called for a society that builds communities, not prisons. Then we've had campaigns that ActionStation has run in support of Māori wards. They campaigned, as I mentioned in Cassie's intro, on Ihu Mātao for Matariki, also advocated for better teaching of Māori history in New Zealand schools. And in fact, I found in my research, between September 2018 and August 2019, almost a third of ActionStation's campaigns related to Māori rights. Now, this is very different, and I compare it to other organisations in my book. It's very different to the other organisations in terms of their own campaigns on minority rights. And I think what's important to stress is that ActionStation saw their role as not just reacting to preferences, but also in helping to shape and educate. So to conclude, the book argues that we've got new types of organisations. They're member-driven, multi-issue, rapid response, and they can take the internet enables them to operate in this way. They use digital analytics to listen to members, to craft campaign messaging, and they gain power from mobilising citizens to put pressure on their national governments, both online and offline, right? They're not just operating online. And these organisations exist around the world. I'm happy to talk about some of the other ones in Q&A. And there's a real strength in that model, but there's also a weakness in it, and that being so member-driven can mean that some issues fall through the cracks, or there aren't sustained campaigns on, particularly around minority rights. And that's where ActionStation has come in and evolved the model, and I would argue is a really interesting lesson, both within New Zealand but also internationally. And that's how we got Matariki. So I'll leave it there. I'm going to hand over to Cassie to respond and provide her own insights into ActionStation and why she joined that organisation, and then we will do some Q&A together. Thank you.
I te awa kura. Ko papatūna ku kei raro, ko ranginui kei runga, ko ngā tangata kei Wainganui tihei Māori ora. Kia ora tātou. Tēnā koutou ki te tuatahi i te mana whenua o tēnei rohe. Tēnā koutou ki te te awa me taranaki whānui o tēnei rohe. Tēnā koutou ki ngō manaakitanga me te kaihaututanga i tēnei rohe. Tēnā koutou. Tēnā koe kia Philip mo te tono i tēnei wā. Tēnā koutou ki ngā Fabian Society i tēnei wā hoki. Tēnā koe ehua me te kai kōrero anina. Mō tō rangahau me te ihi me te wehi mō te rōpū o Open. Ne? Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Kia ora tātou. I te tau tōku pāpā no Ingarani no Kotarani no Itaria ahau. I te taha o tōku māma, ko Tararua te maunga, ko Hoki o te awa, ko Ngāti Raukawa te iwi, ko Ngāti Pariraukawa te hapu, ko ngā tokowaru te marae. I whakatipu aki a hau ki te awakarangi me whanganui, engari kei te noho au ki Porirua i nainei, ko Cassie Hartendorp tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora everyone. My name is Cassie. Thank you for this opportunity, Fabian Society, to be able to speak tonight. It is such a joy and a pleasure actually to be able to hear from Nina, because one second, I'm a bit shorter. you know, the deep dive that Nina has done into the open network is a real blessing and a joy, because for us who work in places such as this, we very rarely get the time to be able to research or deeply look into the practice and the theory, I guess the theoretical foundations of what is taking place within our network, okay? We're rapid response, we're constantly doing, we're testing, we're trying things out, we're ActionStation, there's a lot of action in there. And so I just want to mihi to you, Nina, for spending 5 long years exploring our network and learning what there is to learn about it. Yeah, because I think one of the things for me is that, you know, a lot of us and a lot of you know what ActionStation is, but also there is a challenge inherent within this organisation type. And I think part of that is the digital nature to it, for better or for worse, which Nina has talked about. But there's also this very interesting evolving form of organisation. So we started in 2014, ActionStation started in 2014. We're a baby, we are a retainer, we are small, we are young, right? In terms of the history of progressive action, of social and political movements, many of which, I mean, let's be real, there is a whole library of knowledge right in this room right now about the history of political and social movements within Aotearoa and beyond. Yeah, that I'm looking at yous right here. I'm a baby to this stuff in the grand scheme of things, but the beauty of this network is that it's been able to meet our current times, meet our current moment, and evolve and develop pretty much on the fly. We often use the term, we're building the plane while we're flying it in our team. It feels like often it is a building, trying, testing, how does this work, while we're learning how to do it. So Nina's obviously given a broad overview of the network and talked about some of the strengths and limitations. And what I thought that I'd offer here today is to be able to talk a little bit about, first of all, why ActionStation, because it is a unique organisation and I don't go into anything lightly. So I thought it might be useful to be able to talk about how I ended up here and the decisions I made about why to be here working for this particular organisation. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about what a day in the life of one of our campaigners looks like, so you can get a bit of a picture. We do a lot of work online, and I think sometimes people might think we're a little bit like email robots, and rest assured we are real human beings. We have 11 staff in total, 8 FTE, so not many, but I can rest assured we are all real human beings, and I thought I'd just share a little bit about what our day might look like if you're interested, and then maybe talk a little bit about some of that tension, that really interesting tension, which is a beautiful, productive, political dialectic constantly in action, that is the member-driven versus the values-driven, because as Nina says, it's something we've picked up and evolved, but arguably it's interesting no matter what part of the world that you're in. So first of all, why ActionStation? Why did I choose to be here in this room with all of you as opposed to any other organisation? So as mentioned, my background is I identify pretty strongly as a lefty, as a left-winger. I've been involved in different movements, and particularly an organising element, community organising, so trying to build up power within communities to be able to fight for change that might not happen without that, yeah? So at some point I made the conscious decision, so I'm 32, I was born in 1989, if you want to get a picture of where my life is slotting in the big trajectory of the world. And having been involved, I guess, in different forms of activism since I was 19, I made the decision a few years ago where I thought, what am I doing? What am I actually doing? I've done so much head banging against brick wall type of activism, right? I cannot tell you how many protests I've run down these very streets. Countless. It's one of the things I love to do, and yeah, when I hear about the protest movement yesterday in this very city, I'm like, oh no, that's a whole different take. But finding that to create progressive change required, I guess, not wanting to bang my head against the wall constantly all of the time. So I made a decision that I wanted to work in service specifically of ending capitalism, just the little girl things that you think about when you go to sleep at night, and creating a country that ultimately rejects colonisation. So we're not a colonising country. We don't act in violent service of an empire here. How can we create a country that does that? So in seeing that capitalism and colonisation were two interrelated systems causing mass harm the world over, the other thing I made a decision about was starting from a place of recognising Aotearoa as part of Te Moana Nui Ākiwa, and therefore our political solutions require an understanding of our unique history, which is based on whakapapa and mātauranga Māori, and all of the knowledge that came before mātauranga Māori as well from our Pacific tuakana. So I guess my first political education was sitting in a reading group reading Marx. No regrets there. I think that was a great, can't go wrong with dialectical materialism and political economy when you're a 19-year-old trying to work out what surplus value is. But what I will say is that a lot of the political ideas that we're often trained in came from a European standpoint. And for me, I was thinking, in order to be able to deeply understand the political tensions and dynamics, and therefore the possibilities of political change, that actually requires knowing our whenua, knowing our moana, knowing our area. So grounding my politics within that. And my other decision was to focus on building power outside of Parliament. So I believe that people and communities have the ability to transform the world. We always are. And that we needed to empower ourselves to do that rather than purely relying on politicians to take the right action. So these were some of the decisions that I made about where to place energy. I believe that everyone has a role to play within social change should they wish to choose it. And the role I was drawn to was as a political organiser, bringing together Indigenous knowledge, community organising within marginalised communities, and traditional union organising. So those are the things that have kind of formed where I come from. And just want to acknowledge as well, a lot of my influence was from local unionists. So former fast food worker organiser Helene Prattley, and early childhood organiser and Palestinian activist Nadia Abu Shinab, as well as many other figures. And so having a strong grounding in what it means to build power to win, which the union knows well about. At some point I was like, I'm just going to take any union job that I can get my foot in the door. Found myself in hospitals around the country recruiting low-paid, undervalued admin staff to get on board a major pay equity claim. These were women in back offices who hadn't seen a pay rise in 30 years often, and yet were labelled as unskilled and holding together our entire healthcare system. So my colleague at the time, Rebecca Davey, and I would find ourselves in maze-like corridors and tiny offices where admin staff would tell us that fellow staff members had recently committed suicide due to the stress and the overload, but the hospital hadn't done anything about it and were just hushing it up. So for me, being in those spaces, it was real. But my time in the union came to a short demise because it wasn't long before Laura O'Connell-Rapira, the former director of ActionStation, in true direct fashion, rocked up to my kapahaka group. Funnily enough, kia ora Lainey, because Lainey's a part of that kapahaka group, Te Whanawhana as well. One night Laura rocked up, told me she was creating a job for someone like me, and asked when my contract ended. I didn't really know her, but found that was a very flattering and direct way to talk about it. So when the job came up, ultimately, I needed to make a decision on whether or not I would invest my time in the unions, and I was stuck on it, right? Because I'm like, the unions have this strong base of workers from which to build power from, right? And then I was being asked to enter into this organisation that felt like this amorphous kind of network, like this nebulous, so are people members? Are they not members? Are they this? Are they that? That sometimes felt more than like an email database than necessarily a clear foundation base from which to grow political power. So in all honesty, at that time, I wasn't fully convinced that ActionStation, who I'd barely heard of, were an effective political organisation for the goals that I was working towards, which I named. But partly, I wasn't sure about rapid response campaigns as well. because I wasn't convinced that they would cause the kind of long-term systemic change that we need to transform, for example, our economic system. And I was worried that we could enter too easily into gimmicky, opportunistic, personality politics type politics, and didn't really do the work of empowering communities beyond electoral cycle, get out the vote type campaigns. So this was my conundrum, going to sleep at night thinking, where do we build power for a political base? And in the end, I decided to take a chance and apply on ActionStation. And the reasons for this, to give you some insight to this, is that, you know, while unions are important, and especially as a young person, I think they're an institution that we want to keep. I thought that ActionStation had the power to connect with a younger generation, to be creative, to be dynamic, to be bold, and particularly as someone who is takatapui Māori, being able to see what we've talked about as minority issues, right? What we've talked about as te tiriti issues, as some of the fundamental ruptures and tensions within our current society. I saw that there was an organisation paying attention to that and not running from it or hiding from it or pretending it doesn't exist or skirting around the edges. How do we go into the heart of how we might change our current system so that it works for everyone, so that people no longer have to suffer? So I thought, okay, let's try this thing out and see how it goes. As mentioned, I was community organiser for 2 years, and in that time, the possibilities proved themselves constantly to be real. So as Nina mentioned, we were able to play supportive roles. So I didn't lead Protect Ihu Mātao or the Black Lives Matter work, but we were able to provide support for that to happen. Protect Ihu Mātao in particular has to date been our biggest petition, community-led petition on our website. That just is what it is. We had the most support we've ever had with that. We often took backseat roles, such as hosting petitions, raising money. We raised $100,000 for Protect Ihu Mātao when the occupiers got evicted, and we were able to get as many people as possible up there to be able to hold on to the whenua. We've mentored young people to run massive demonstrations. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement march that was here last year, which is said to be the largest march in a decade. In other times, we might have taken front-facing leadership. So there's something about this organisation that allows us to be able to move quite fluidly and responsively between going out on the forefront and taking leadership and knowing when actually we might not be the right people to do that. When is it communities that actually need to speak for themselves and act for themselves? So there's something about that that is able to be really responsive. So what does a day in the life for us look like? So having gone from this kind of big picture even further into the ground, I wanted to let you know what a day in the life of one of our campaigners might look like as an example. So first of all, we get up and we connect with the rest of the team virtually. We check in with how we are as humans. This is important in this current age. We have karakia at the start of the week, and sometimes we even have virtual dance parties if we're lucky. Our campaigners will then kick into gear. So they might start the day by working on a long-term campaign, for example, a multi-organisational coalition of groups who pulled their power this year to push the government to hold their first ever benefit-focused budget, for example. There were 70 plus organisations who signed an open letter to increase benefits. I haven't seen anything like that in my lifetime before, and part of it was doing that behind-the-scene work to build coalitions, to build power to push the government. The campaigners might facilitate meetings with those organisations, sometimes holding multiple organisations in a room at a time, moving people towards a strategy for how to win in political change, or having phone calls with individuals to gauge where the interest is at next. Next, maybe they have some morning tea, but probably not. Next, they might be supporting a local community-led petition on our online platform, which is called our ActionStation, and no doubt you've been asked to sign one of those petitions at some point. We have over 800,000 unique actions have happened on our ActionStation, and we have over 400,000 people currently who have taken an action and are engaged within our wider network and community. So it's not small stuff. You know, Fred wants to stop a local water bottling plant in his area. He knows it's wrong, and his local Friends of Somewhere group have decided to start a campaign. They don't know much about online petitions, so our campaigner gets on the phone to them, hears out what the issue is, and helps them get a campaign up and running and offer ideas about what a strategy could look like, how to just sway the decision maker. So we're still in the morning right now. On another day, perhaps a rapid response issue has reached us, such as the refugee intake for Afghanistan, and noticing, honestly, picking the bees instead of refugees just does my head in a little bit. So thanks for bringing up that. But another example might be this rapid response approach to what happened in Afghanistan a couple of months ago. So our campaigner switches into gear, reaches out to relevant groups and communities, holds meetings, forms a plan that could include organising a webinar to spread the issue, starting a campaign to ask people to email their MPs to pressure them to take action. It could even involve training people to talk to their MPs if they've never done it before, starting a social media campaign. The options or the tactics are really quite endless depending on our imagination and what can work. Sometimes that campaigner might work long into the night on an issue that really matters, trying to make the most of the political moment and create the most impact as possible. Later on in the day, the campaigner might take a stop and have a virtual water cooler moment with another staff member, like meeting the tech team to find out the best way to create a digital tool. And by the end of the day, as you can imagine, our campaigners tend to be pretty tired, and every single day is really, really different. So that's a bit of a snapshot, and a lot of it, because it is rapid response, we're often moving in and out of different issues and different tactics quite a lot. And do I have any time for something else, or should we turn to questions? And just to comment on the values versus member-led approach and how that it plays out in an everyday kind of situation. So how that might work is, for example, that petition from Fred that comes in that talks about a proposed water bottling plant. You know, our values lens because there's lots of petition platforms out there, you know, you can go to many different things, but for us, our values are first and foremost. So our values lens might ask, what does the local mana whenua have to say about this water bottling plant? Have you talked with them? Is there an opportunity to collaborate? How do you acknowledge tino rangatiratanga in your work? Another tension might come up with maybe we start a project where we want to encourage people to politically dream about a vision of Aotearoa they want. So we just went through this recently, and we did a people-powered visioning process in the past, that kai and kōrero, but we realised that the majority of the people who were involved were older, middle-class, highly educated Pākehā who are awesome. But we were wondering where people are at and how we hear from people who might not ordinarily get a chance to be able to vision of a different Aotearoa. So instead of using our general, everybody come in and get involved and share with us what your dream Aotearoa might look like, we pivoted our project idea and specifically gathered young people from marginalised communities, Māori, Pacific, Black, people of colour, refugees and disabled whānau to dream of a better Aotearoa, and we listened deeply to them and allowed their dreams to guide us, even though we know that actually what those dreams might look like might be a little bit different to what our wider membership would look like. But to us, it's really important to be able to find the values of who are the voices in the work of the future that we need to be listening to, as well as the voice in the future of now. So those are some of the day-to-day things that the ActionStation work looks like, and happy to answer any other questions that you might have. Kia ora tātou.
Okay, any questions? Yes.
Thanks. For those who are listening online, the question was, is this only a progressive phenomenon, or do we see it also amongst conservative groups? And really great question. I'm going to jump through the slides quickly because this is the question I'm asking now with the Weizenbaum, the German Internet Institute, is have we seen groups on the right emulate? And so the short answer is left-wing groups started out this model of digital advocacy organisation. But there are a few instances on the right of groups trying to copy it. In the US, there's a group called Grassfire that's currently active. In Australia, this is Advance Australia. This is actually their GetUp captain that they were trying to emulate. And, sorry, just get some water. One thing that I would say is all of the attempts haven't fully understood the model. So what the right has done is seen that there's power in this organizing and thought, let's copy it. But in doing so, they haven't understood the intricacies of the model, and most of the organizations we've seen in our work haven't been, I would argue, truly member-driven, that they've had funding, often from big philanthropic sources, and they tend to be much more top-down driven, so that they use the internet to kind of mobilize people, but direct them very specifically into particular campaigns or particular issues, rather than trying to devolve powers. Say, for instance, what Casey was talking about, the Our ActionStation petition platform, where people can sign up and create their own. Very few of these organizations have that, except for Citizen Go is one example that does. The other thing I would say is that there have been attempts, and a lot of them have failed. Like, they've actually found it really hard to get off the ground, and there's a number of cases of that in the US. So yeah, it's an interesting space, and I would say overall the right has sought other models, has sought other forms of organization, not so much the digital advocacy organization model that I've described to organize. Yeah, sure.
And have there been ways it's placed individuals at risk?
So the question there was, is this the model in Hong Kong, and has the model put individuals at risk? And when you, just to clarify, what did you mean by individuals at risk?
Really, but I'm just aware maybe that in Hong Kong they seem to be able to do some quite rapid crowd gathering, but that China seemed to be able to target leaders, and I wondered if there was some way that the model, or you say using computers, which I'm hopeless at, can become taken away from a group by the right-wing force.
Yeah, so I think one of the things I try to do in the book is really situate the phenomenon of the action stations of the world against other digitally enabled social movements. And I'm not an expert on Hong Kong, and one thing I would note is that most social movements are using the internet to campaign, right? There's a very broad phenomenon. Most NGOs are using the internet to campaign. Most organizations, I mean, we all use it in our everyday lives. So the very concept of using the internet or using social media isn't in itself distinct. The ways that Hong Kong organizes, I wouldn't say it's the same as this model, partly because it's a social movement more organization. They've sought to be leaderless. They don't have this kind of permanent infrastructure of staff that are really looking and replicated the model I describe of member-driven, multi-issue. You know, Hong Kong has one particular issue. That's not to say there can't be learning happening across it, but I think there's a deeper point that your question gets to, which is all of the organizations in my study operate in democracies. It's very difficult to mobilize citizen power and use the active petition where your voice isn't being heard, where if you organize, there's active repression or other forms like we would see in Hong Kong. There are a couple of cases, and this gets to your question about activists and sort of threats on them, where they're operating. So there's a group in Poland, Action Demokracja, which I've visited in Warsaw, as well as another in Hungary, and they're obviously very difficult context to campaign in. And both of those organizations have faced threats. And to be honest, some of these organizations have faced threats in like Western democracies like Canada and Australia. So it's not only in sort of semi-authoritarian spaces where activists working in these organizations have had difficult times. But I think the key answer to your question is more this point, that they are operating in democratic contexts where they can mobilise citizens on the streets legally and put pressure on elected decision makers who will listen to them. And that's the theory of change. No worries. I can see 3 questions, which is great. Shall we go across the room? And and also for Cassie, obviously, as well. Yeah.
Do you not think that these rapid response groups, this digital advocacy, in a way is distorting our society? I mean, we're getting results which I don't think are shared by the general populace. I'll give you an example. It's rather benign, but I think it's got sinister implications. Every year the concert programme does a little survey on, it's called Settling the Score, and they ask listeners to online to write in what are their most preferred pieces of music that they'd like to hear.
Yeah.
Now, generally, it's, the same things come in year out. It's usually, it's been the Vaughan Williams, the Larkasine thing, something by Mozart, Beethoven, a Rachmaninoff piano concerto, 4 last songs by Strauss. Usually they're the ones in the top 10 of the 100. Well, anyway, 2 years ago, the whole thing was upended because a whole lot of girls from Epsom Girls Grammar nominated. They've got their school song is woven around the tune of Verdi's Triumphal March from Aida. So they've got different words, but the tune is from Aida. So their music master encouraged them. He said, look, reply or nominate the Triumphal March of Aida. So they swamped the website and it won the competition. It proves, though, how distorted it was, because the following year it wasn't in the top 100. It just disappeared. Now the same thing happened last year. An oratorio by Anthony Richards. He's a professor of music at.
What's your question, though?
Yes. Well, I'm just coming to it. I'm coming to it.
We'll
He's
get
a
there
professor of
quickly.
music at Otago University. And there was a premiere of this oratorio. It was based around Gallipoli or something like that. I don't do oratorios, I'm not interested in them, so I wouldn't have listened to it if it was on. Anyway, all the orchestra swamped the website, so that obscure work won the first prize, was the most popular competition. The point is, though, can I just finish, this year they've abolished it because it's being abused so much.
So I think this raises a really interesting question about the role of moderating popular, campaigns and petitions. And to me, I mean, Cassie can speak to this in her role as somebody campaigning on it. But what I'm trying to get at in this talk is that these digital advocacy organizations aren't just offering platforms that anyone can use and populate however they want. There are staff that are moderating and deciding which petitions get up, which ones get more staff time and support to disseminate them. And so it's not a free-for-all, I guess, is my answer to your question. What I'm hearing from you is that these examples were people, deciding that they wanted a popularity contest, and we're going to put forward to the listeners. He was giving examples of music competitions on concert radio, and that some years, one group just could totally dominate. And this is where I think all of the organizations that I study would be very careful about if we took a similar thing, if there was a campaign that was getting a huge amount of support that didn't align with their values, they would either take it off if it was just, let's kick all the refugees out of New Zealand, for instance. That campaign wouldn't be posted on the petition platform. And so there are tools that these groups would use. Now, I guess part of my research is highlighting and asking the question of how much they're used, and there's a variation across the network. And some groups, like 38 Degrees in the UK, for instance, might fall more in the direction of what you're saying, of like just letting people react and respond. And some groups like ActionStation would be much more careful and thoughtful about which issues get space in the public debate. So the real answer, I guess I'm saying, is that I don't think they inherently have to be used in the way that you describe. I don't know if Cassie has a response as well to that. I'll just give her some space.
First of all, I think that we've found the next topic for the next Fabian Society, called it all. Like, honestly, I'm just, there's so much knowledge that you have in that. No, can I actually just respond? Because I'd like to be able to respond. I mean, if you look at it like that, is not democracy very much the same thing right? There's a question about, do our democratic politics accurately represent the people and the decisions that need to get made? So I think that question is not unique to our organisation. Every organisation has their values, mission and vision and where they go. I would argue that for us at ActionStation, we probably tip slightly more into valuing what the minority voice might be and how it aligns with our values. So, for example, you can go to change.org. You could have a very incendiary petition on any topic and get 100,000 people and then say, look, this is a really big issue, we need action now from the government. However, within our network, we're making, as said, constant decisions about, is this the Aotearoa that we're trying to work towards? What does it mean to accept this petition? What does it mean to be able to use this information? Is it in service of a vision of a better Aotearoa? Or is it pure, for example, left-wing populism or opportunism? So I think the point being is that as an organisation, we're making constant ethical, I think, decisions about how we're using data information. And I know that you've got more to say on that, and I'm just checking.
For people to vote. In the old days, you'd have to fill in a letter, you'd have to post it. And I think that's a more adequate reflection of people who are seriously interested in that issue in question. It's just too easy now. You just click, and people are not thinking, and they're passing it on. You send this on to a friend or whatever. I mean, that's the point of my question. The old days, you sort out the sheep from the goats.
Yep. And I think Nina's got a point on. Do you want to talk about collectivism?
Sure, I'll deal with it quickly because I can see there are two other questions in the audience, unless you wanted to give a quick response, Cassie?
No, you go.
Okay,
That's
great.
the mic, yeah.
I think your point is more about collectivism, which is a common one, that, yeah, you can just share something on Facebook or on Twitter and people aren't thinking deeply about issues. And I guess what I've been trying to emphasize here is many of these groups aren't just doing things online. They're mobilizing people on the streets. They're doing long campaigns. And they are about more than just sharing something. And so, as I think Cassie has talked about a lot, there's deep thinking in the staff about strategies and about campaigning. And interestingly, the debate about collectivism in the academic space has been widely dismissed. I think it does exist in an ongoing way in public debates, but most of the academic debates around the ways that organizations use digital tactics has shifted to ask what combinations are most effective and when. So it's not saying social media is always effective or it's never effective, it's understanding the different ways that it can be effective under different conditions, which is, I know, a very academic answer, but I guess the truth is it's more complex than that. All right, I think we'll move on to, I can see we have two other questions and I'm also aware of time. So maybe, yeah, you had a question and then there was something else on, yeah.
I just want to know a little more about the Open Network. Basically, you mentioned the summits and it looks like you shared some software as well. I'm just kind of interested in some other examples of how you might work together in a more day-to-day way between summits or what kind of collaborations you might have.
Sure. The question was about the Open Network, which was the network that ActionStation is part of, which is a transnational network including groups from Hungary, Switzerland, Sweden, South Africa. There's a lot of layers to those collaborations. What I've observed, and Cassie can jump in as well, is deep sharing about technology and actually pooling resources around specific technology like our ActionStation platform. Those sorts of technologies have been developed and supported through the ActionStation network. Campaigning tactics and messaging, so say the trade campaign or climate or refugees, figuring out what messaging really works. Not all lessons learned in one context will transfer, obviously. Skills development, really basic things. Most people who come into these organizations, just like Cassie talked about, aren't digital campaigners. They're not people that have started out online. They might have a union background. They may have background in organizing festivals or something completely different. And so it's also learning a trade and a skill. And also, interestingly, Open has supported the growth of the network. So there's a lot that goes into building up new organizations, finding groups in, say, France or Israel, and supporting and growing the network of people that follow this model. But yeah, I have a lot more to say on it, so I'm happy to chat after this. Did you want to add anything?
I just add in, a few weeks ago, there was an idea through our network to be able to raise funds to be able to put together a newspaper ad that would reach UK and Glasgow newspapers in relation to COP26, big climate change conference that's happening over there at the moment. And so our organisations collaborated on what a full-page ad in a newspaper could be to be able to urge people to support government leaders taking stronger action on climate change. Our awesome young Māori climate justice advisor, made sure that indigenous voices were in there as well. So there's a paper ad that we've all signed on to and be able to support. So we can do things around tactics as well. Yeah.
Great. Max, you had a question, and then go to
Kia ora koutou. Thanks very much both for your presentations, which I really enjoyed. My question was about sort of putting this work in the context of, you know, the big sort of neoliberal ideological movement, which was, you know, incredibly well funded and took 30 years more or less, but was then incredibly successful at shifting the groundwork of, you know, a lot of assumptions about politics, you know, from the collective to the individual, from government to market. And Cassie, in particular, you mentioned some very big high-level objectives, if you want to put it in those terms, and you said you didn't want to get distracted from those just by running, you know, sort of specific campaigns. So I guess my question sort of for both of you is, do you feel you're able to? Do you see these kinds of groups making that big, low-level, foundational ideological change, or does that actually feel too hard, too far out of reach for organisations that are too stretched for resources a lot of the time?
What a great question, thank you. I mean, yes, a lot of, you know, the neoliberal project was pretty successful, and it takes a lot to be able to challenge that. But I think where it comes in is that there's a couple of things. It is easy to get into overwhelmed sometimes about the whole state of the world, and I think anyone can do that, and I won't pretend that we're immune to that. However, the beauty that I'm learning about campaigning is that you're working towards specific goals. You know, you have a vision in mind, and to be fair, you know, I want to end capitalism. As an organisation, ActionStation might not share the exact same vision, but you know, we do have a vision that's been brought together from people at dinner tables talking about the Aotearoa they want. And the beauty of campaigns is that you're able to take out chunks and be like, this is a clear reform, this is a clear path for how we're going to work on this. And also building up movements, I think, is a really big thing as well. So what can we do that other organisations like sometimes Oxfam and whatnot can't, is that we're able to build up movements and channel power towards specific political changes. So in answer to that, yeah, no, sometimes it's a bit by bit kind of situation. We have, you know, for example, we've had somebody work on welfare for the past 2.5 years, and the work that has gone on the ground compared to just what you would see in the political reform, I think, is directly challenging those years of neoliberalism, but you would only see sometimes the results in small bursts along the way. Yeah, are we stretched? Always, absolutely. But the other thing that I didn't mention as much in there, the beauty of me to this network of what I've learned, you know, because I did come into it quite cynical, but after 2 years, I was like, man, I can so see why this model has been successful and what it has to offer social movements. And I think in our DNA, we're nimble. We have to be nimble. And so there is something about not just reacting all the time, but there's something about being able to test ideas out and measure things quite quickly and see what gets cut through and what doesn't. And what really drew me in is an ability to be able to be creative and dynamic. And so we are often able to try things out that government-funded organisations can't do in the same way. We can be creative. We can try different things, like have giant poop emojis floating down a river. You know, we can do things like that are a bit fun and quirky and sometimes silly and comical, but we need that. I think we need many different tools in the box to work towards the same kind of vision, and I think, yeah, the creativity and nimbleness really does add something.
I think I'm going to add a bit of a longue durée. Well, it's not that long because the history of these organisations is only about 15 or so years, but one thing I've seen is obviously it's really hard to counter neoliberalism. It's a very high bar that you're setting. And these groups were very strong during the trade campaign. A lot of the European groups that I studied actually kicked off, and there was huge energy to counter the trade and intellectual property agreement between the EU and the US. So much so that most of the organization's growth just skyrocketed, whether it be in Sweden or Ireland, where Uplift that's the ActionStation equivalent in Ireland. And as I mentioned, the German Camp Act just got a lot of support, and they were actually able to run and coordinate a very, very strong campaign in Germany. So much so that they've had, there was just a lot of recognition that they shaped the public debate by experts. But of course, how that ended was kind of this weird, political move, because of course Trump got elected and put an end to TTIP. And so, in fact, it wasn't the left winning the debate, it was the right. And that left a lot of these organizations in a real bind, because they're like, well, a lot of our members are on the same page as Trump that they don't want TTIP, but not on the same page on other issues. And so that actually shifted a lot of the European organizations away from campaigning on trade issues. And trade is only a small slice of what you're talking about. And so that was that's these are some of the dilemmas, right, that these organizations face, and how do they navigate the really last difficult 5 years of campaigning. But then there are examples where I think groups like GetUp have done a lot on economic fairness. They have permanent campaigners that they've decided they really want to work on that in the Australian context, and really dedicate a lot of time and energy. So there are models within, what I've described as the digital advocacy organization, where they say, actually, we want to dedicate staff over a long-term objective and try and get some wins on it. So it's not always rapid response. And to me, that's really interesting, where the groups decide to prioritize, whether it be on te tiriti or economic injustices, and how they do it, often through collaborations. And I think one thing I would take away from my talk is that none of these groups are working on their own, as Cassie said, that they're often working in partnership with others. And in my own view, that's when they're most effective, is when they are working with these expert NGOs and finding ways to collaborate. Because they're not, no individual organization is going to take down neoliberalism, obviously. And the question is more, what are the complementarities between them? Now, there was a woman who was really keen to ask a question, so yeah, please do.
I'm Jan. My question is, I'm all in favour of campaigning groups holding government, nation states to account. But one of the things which I think is rather a dark side of ActionStation, and which I wish would stop happening, is when private individuals are targeted. Private individuals, either anonymously or named individuals. And it's something I'd like to see stop, because I don't think it serves the organisation. And I wonder if there are other members of the Open family that regard targeting private individuals as appropriate.
You might be able to share more. And kia ora, Jan. And Jan just talked about one of the things that Jan doesn't like about ActionStation is the targeting of private individuals, and asked a question about whether or not it's common within the open network to be able to target private individuals. In all honesty, it depends on what the issue is and the values base. I wouldn't say that the majority of our petitions are based around individuals. Usually, that being said, it's usually targeting a decision maker to make a decision, and so that is often an individual to change their decision. I guess my question would be more about what those issues might be and what our values might be around them, is how we make the decision about what we do there. Do you have something to comment?
In power, I'm talking about the targeting of Millie Hill, for example, through a petition. When not only was it targeting a private individual trying to do her job, but it also provided a whole lot of spurious and inaccurate information about her. Okay, so I can't support an organisation that does that, and I'd like to have the conversation about how ActionStation stops doing things like that, because to me it's inappropriate to target private individuals when there are there are conversations to be had within the progressive left on these issues.
So Jen's referring to a specific petition about someone called Millie Hill and a targeting around individual in that sense. So around this is basically an issue of individuals who have been transphobic. And so that's up to you. So people who have been a part of this petition, is actively organising for transgender whānau to be supported and to be embraced within our communities. And there has been a community-led petition that is talking about basically transphobic individuals and how to deplatform them. And I think different open organisations might have different stances on that. However, it might be something that we agree to disagree on in this instance, Jan. You're welcome to have a conversation with me afterwards. However, this is about having a question and answer rather than a conversation in front of everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, in answer to your question, do other open groups do it? I can't automatically tell you an example of another organisation that has done individuals. I know that they have targeted private individuals like Paul Polman, the head of Unilever, I'm pretty sure has been a target of some campaigns. Typically, the organisations do focus on national governments, as you said, but I'm sure there are other instances, I can't think of off the top of my mind, where not a member or a decision maker of government has been targeted. And I think, yeah, these are the kinds of interesting questions that I think I can see somebody else has I don't know if Beth's hand up is related to this. No, it's not. But I think these are the sorts of interesting questions about where this model, when it was thought about, was really about holding national governments to account. And what I have seen, most of the work has been focused on that. Some of us focuses on businesses specifically, so it's actually slightly different. And they run campaigns really to try and hold multinational companies to account. So there are different examples. And I have seen examples, yeah, within the open network of holding CEOs to account. So I guess, yeah, different examples are out there. Okay, one more question. Oh. Beth, sorry, you've had a question. There's somebody else at the back who wanted to ask one and is very keen, so go for it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It's yeah, interesting stuff. One of the things I'm thinking about is, you know, what's being said in the space around, you know, massive platforms, very powerful like Google and its related companies, and what do you do there? How do you campaign against that? You know, with their, you know, like, because basically you're running on their platforms. A lot of, I mean, I know ActionStation's got their email addresses and can directly communicate with people. But you know, a lot of digital advocacy is around, you know, Facebook or social networks or using Google, and how do you see the future of that developing? So, you know, Google decide that the message isn't for them, suddenly it's down in the rankings, suddenly you don't appear on Facebook.
I think this is a really good example, and you know, a lot of our platforms we can't rely on, because even though we're a values-based organisation, you know, many massive digital companies are not values-based, they're profit-based ultimately. So there is often a clash there, and I think it's an ever-evolving conversation around some of these things. So as an example, we don't massively use Facebook, okay, because Facebook is quite notorious for changing its algorithms all of the time. And so we might test something out and be like, oh, this works really well, we can reach some people, we can put something out there, and then Facebook will change its algorithm, and within a day, everything that you've tested completely doesn't work anymore. So there is a degree of needing to be quite responsive to how these big digital companies are operating. Some of them it feels like we can be reliant on. With email, it's a little bit different because anybody can technically have an email there, and email tends to be one of the more stable ways of being in contact with people, as opposed to social media companies that change the stuff up all the time. We have had a question about, for example, moving away from Amazon Web Services, who we see as fundamentally different to our values, and how we can actually move to a place to have our spaces hosted by a local company. So we're in the process of doing that. But you're right, like that's a very alive, constant thing that's going on there. And I don't have a ready-made answer for all of that. We're working it out as we go.
And I'll just one sentence to say, like Cassie said, across the open network, this is a very live conversation, and it is not one that the groups, I would say, have a single answer to, because they are reliant on social media platforms to run their campaigns, but also very aware of the limitations of them. So, yeah, happy to have more of a chat afterwards.
I'd just like you all to join me in thanking both Nina and Cassie. It's been tremendous. Thank you very much.